Hey guys, so in today's video, I want to talk about an argument that I was recently introduced to again. I haven't heard this argument actually in many, many years, and when someone posted it in one of the debate forums, it was like a light bulb moment. I went, oh my god, this was the argument that led me away from Christianity, and for a number, I believe it was about 3 years, I was an atheist. And so I want to introduce you guys to that argument, and I want to introduce you to why I ended up actually coming back to Christianity. Stay tuned.
I mean, there's a false assumption about science operating here. Science is not in principle committed to the idea that there's no afterlife or that the mind is identical to the brain.
Right.
And there are ways we could, in fact, discover that if it were true. The problem is there are very good reasons to think it's not true. And we know this from now 150 years of neurology, where you damage areas of the brain and faculties are lost. And they're clearly, it's not that everyone with brain damage has their soul perfectly intact. They just can't get the words out. Everything about your mind can be damaged by damaging the brain. You can cease to recognize faces, you can cease to know the names of animals, but you still know the names of tools. I mean, what we're being asked to consider is that you damage one part of the brain and the mind, something about the mind and subjectivity is lost. You damage another and yet more is lost. And yet if you damage the whole thing at death, we can rise off the brain with all our faculties intact, recognizing grandma and speaking English. Now,
so this argument is, in many respects, when I was younger, I heard this and I thought, man, this is really irrefutable. This is really, this is solid stuff. And some of you might even be watching this and thinking, wow, that is a really good position, right? We look at the human brain and it's, if you dismantle one part of the brain, you lose this ability. You dismantle another part of the brain, you lose this ability. But we're expected to believe that when a person dies, their soul just magically lifts out of their body and reacquires all of these things. It seems pretty implausible. And this really was the argument that had led me to the conviction that theism was no longer something that I wanted to entertain, that I now considered myself a proper atheist, because I said, even if there is a God, it's irrelevant if there's no afterlife. And when we look at people with dementia or people with Alzheimer's disease, it seems pretty clear that the deterioration of their brain coincides with the deterioration of their conscious self. Now, why in any case would we suppose that the self is suddenly reconstituted without a brain? We have no memories before being born. Why would we expect to have any after? And this really, I think, is a very solid position to scrutinize and critique religion, all save for one very small problem. And this was really something that was introduced to me through the psychologist Carl Gustav Jung. I started to study Joseph Campbell's work, and this was recommended to me by an existentialist that I worked with. And I was reading The Hero with 1,000 Faces. I was also reading Carl Gustav Jung's Man and His Symbols. But I found many of Carl Jung's concepts hard to understand. And so I found myself routinely going online and finding videos or different resources to help me better understand the work of this renowned psychologist. And there was one video in particular that I came across that really, for me, in some sense, caused a kind of intellectual crisis.
You have written at one time and another some sentences which have surprised me a little about death. Now, in particular, I remember you said that death is psychologically just as important as birth. And like it's an integral part of life, but surely it can't be like birth if it's an end, can it?
Yes, if it's an end. And there we are not quite certain about this end. Because, there are these peculiar faculties of the psyche, that it isn't entirely confined to space and time. You can have dreams or visions of the future. You can see round corners and such things. Only ignorance deny these facts. It's quite evident that they do exist and have existed always. Now these facts show that the psyche, in part at least, is not dependent upon these confinements. And then what? When the psyche is not under that obligation to live in time and space alone, and obviously it doesn't, then to that extent the psyche is not submitted to those laws.
You know, these words, only ignorance deny these facts, really hit me like a freight train, because it suggests something which has deep and profound implications for our whole discussion and dialogue. If precognitive dreams exist, then the implication is that the psyche is capable of transcending space and time. Now, if the psyche is capable of transcending space and time, then by association, the psyche is also capable of transcending causation, causality, right? This is really the whole picture that we've just dealt with in the previous argument of saying the mind breaks down with the deterioration of the brain, and the logical conclusion is that there is a continuation of causality, that once the moment of death arises, the causation which preceded the moment of death continues on into death, meaning if the brain deteriorates, the self deteriorates with it, and death is nothing other than the complete and total end of that deterioration of the psyche. But if precognitive dreams exist, then it suggests that some faculty of the psyche is capable of transcending time and therefore by association, transcending causality. And for me, this represented a tremendously rich opportunity, because I looked at this and I said, well, wait a minute, I'm not talking about the Higgs boson. I'm not talking about, a planet in orbit around Alpha Centauri. I'm not talking about, some phenomena that requires extravagant scientific instruments of inquiry in order to observe. I have a mind and I have dreams, which means if there is such thing as a precognitive dream, this is something that I should be able to observe for myself. I don't have to necessarily function on blind faith to come to this conclusion. So Carl Jung is asserting that this is a self-evident and obvious fact. And so as an atheist, I said to myself, well, if this is a self-evident and obvious fact, then it should be something that I'm capable of observing. And so following that logic, I started to record my dreams. And I recorded my dreams over a period of several months, but nothing of a precognitive nature ever arose. And in the time of recording those dreams, I was also contemplating the fact that I had to have a certain degree of scrutiny about these dreams. And I could not, for instance, have a dream of, say, rain falling in a dream, and then I conveniently wake up and it happens to be raining outside. Okay, that's not an example of precognition. The scientific critique of precognitive dreams is to suggest that precognitive dreams are little more than the result of random dreams coincidentally coinciding with physical events. In other words, if you have these random images coming up in your mind on a regular basis, it's only a matter of time until one of those dreams just happens to coincidentally coincide with some external event, right? Which is a logical thing to say. So if I'm going to accept that precognitive dreams are a reality, then I have to be confronted with a situation in which there is no ambiguity. There's no room for interpretation or any kind of blurriness in terms of what's happening. In fact, the ideal precognitive dream would be a precognitive dream in which you are literally looking through your own eyes in the future and recounting a series of events in exact procession as they happen from the perspective you would have in the future. And I recognize this, I discern this. I thought, if I'm going to have a precognitive dream, it has to be some kind of a dream that follows these qualities, that has this quality of being irrefutable. It had no ambiguity, no blurriness, right? And I carried on recording my dreams for quite some time, and nothing happened. In fact, I was about ready to give up on the whole experiment. But then I recalled something about Jungian psychology. Carl Gustav Jung asserted that the psyche is really organized by this central nucleus, which is traditionally referred to within Jungian psychology as the self archetype. In his book, Man and His Symbols, he talks about this. He says that the dreaming life is really organized by the self archetype. And this Christian or Abrahamic notion of God is in many respects a kind of projection of this inner self, this inner Atman, this inner organizing nucleus that constitutes the fundamental I. And really, this is an idea which we see echoed within Buddhism and within Hinduism. This is the Atman, the Brahman. This is the sense of a divine self that dwells within. And Carl Gustav Jung suggested that this was a psychological reality, that this was an observable tendency within the psyche. And so I entertained the possibility that perhaps I could not receive a precognitive dream without the cooperation of this organizing center. And this for me, I had been an atheist for some time at this point, and this for me represented a real compromise of my pride, because the prospect, of course, was that in order to invoke this precognitive dream, or to experience and observe this precognitive dream, I would have to invoke the help of some supernatural entity, right? I would have to, quote unquote, pray, right? So that for me was a very difficult thing. But I looked at it and I said to myself, well, I'm more interested in what's real than interested in how I feel about these things. I mean, how I feel about God is of no consequence. What I'm concerned with is whether or not there's some truth to these suggestions and to these claims. So I set my pride aside and I started to pray, and I prayed before I went to bed, and I would simply ask, I would say, if there is some intelligence out there that's responsible for organizing my dreaming life, and I didn't really want to use the word God, that really was too much for me. I just said, if there's this organizing nucleus within the psyche, then I would like to know it. Please present me a precognitive dream. Now, at the time, it just so happened that I was looking for work. I was unemployed, and I was between jobs. I was actually trying to leave the construction industry, and I wanted to get some kind of a job that required less physical labor, something inside, something that was a little bit easier on my body. And so it just so happened that I had a dream in which I saw myself standing in a hardware store. And I immediately got the impression that I worked there. And I looked around and I looked over and I saw a group of 4 people standing together over and across from a kind of housewares section, a kind of section where, you have blinds and taps and, things of this kind. And I was standing adjacent to all of this kind of plumbing equipment. And I looked around and I seen these 4 people, and they were all discussing something among themselves. And then one of them looked towards me, and that was it. That was the end of the dream. It was not very long. It was not very, there was not a great deal of complexity, but it was incredibly vivid. I remembered distinctly, and even the things that I had thought in the dream. And so I scribbled a note down in one of my journals, and I said, I'd better follow up on this. And so I decided, as a consequence of this dream, to go and apply at Totem, because I knew that the employees at Totem happened to wear orange smocks. And so I thought to myself, well, if this is a precognitive dream, maybe it's even some good advice on where I can get a job. And so I handed in a resume at Totem, and nothing came of it. They didn't call me. I didn't get any calls back from Totem. And so for the most part, I forgot about the dream, and I didn't really lend it much significance. And in fact, I dropped the whole experiment entirely. I said, this is going nowhere, right? So I forgot about it, gave up on the whole business. And a few months went by, and eventually I did get a job at a hardware store, but it was a Home Depot job, and I was not too impressed about working there. But at this point, I was desperate for work. This was in the midst of a recession, just so happened. And so I took the job, and I went in and I worked at a 4 a.m. shift, and I was an inventory specialist. And one day, and this was several months later, I was standing there in the plumbing section going through the aisles, and I looked up over towards the taps and the blind section, and there were 4 people standing there, and all of a sudden, deja vu came over me. I felt as if vividly I had seen this before. And not only that, I started to think thoughts that were appropriate to the dream. I started thinking things like, why am I here? What is this place? I'm starting to think the thoughts I had thought in the dream. And I looked around, and then all of a sudden it came all at once, where it was, oh my God, this is the dream. And it was precisely what I had seen. I had been looking through my eyes relative to a different time. So this for me represented a total disruption of this idea that the psyche is bound to causality, that ultimately the mind is subservient to causation within physical reality. And so you can see here that I have offered for the atheist, for the skeptic, an experiment. I mean, this is something you can do for yourself. This is not I'm not saying, you have to just believe me. I mean, this is something that's observable, testable, right? Perhaps even replicatable and falsifiable, right? So that this really, for me, was the end of my atheistic thinking. And I say that with some hesitation because it was not so much the end of my atheistic thinking, because we have to recognize the word atheist refers to God. In many senses, actually, I was still practically an atheist because, in fact, I went on to practice Buddhism after that. And, Buddhism is an atheistic religion. So when I say this was the end of my atheistic thinking, that's kind of a misnomer because, in fact, what it was more so the end of my materialistic thinking. It was the end of my conviction that only physical things are real. And this, for me, raised a number of profound questions about the nature of the psyche. And it was at this point that I really started to probe the nature of the mind. I wanted to understand, what is the nature of consciousness? What is the nature of subjectivity? What is the nature of dreaming? Right? A materialistic, reductionist worldview that most scientists hold is the idea that essentially only physical things are real. There's this paradigm of saying if you cannot measure it, it does not exist. But this runs right up against something in philosophy which has really represented a major affront to materialistic thinking over the past, probably 400 years. And that is fundamentally the mystery of what's referred to as the explanatory gap. You see, the experience of seeing is not the same thing as photons moving around through space. The experience that we're having, for all intents and purposes, even in terms of neurology, appears to be a reality which is created by the brain. It exists within the mind. It's a subjective reality.
What if I told you that this world around us, this richly textured world, we're all just an illusion constructed in your head?
What if I said that the real world has no smell or taste, no sound? What if I said there's no color?
If you could perceive reality as it really is out there, you wouldn't recognize it at all.
So, this really takes us into a space where we have to ask ourselves, what is the nature of color? What is the nature of texture? What is the nature of temperature that we feel? I mean, and it starts to appear pretty self-evident. I mean, my favorite example of this qualia mystery, this explanatory gap, this mystery of the objective as opposed to the subjective, comes in the form of the color pink. And this is something I really love to tell people about, because pink is, by definition, hallucinatory.
We've all been told that the colors of the rainbow correspond to different wavelengths of visible light: red, orange, yellow, green, blue, and violet. Where's pink in that list? It's not there. There's simply no pink light. So where does pink come from?
I could ask you, perhaps you're an atheist. I could say, well, do you believe in the color pink? And naturally, I would expect, unless, of course, you're colorblind, right? I would expect that you would say, yes, I believe in the color pink because it's something I've seen, right? Well, the thing is that pink does not exist objectively. There is no frequency of electromagnetic radiation on the electromagnetic spectrum that references the color pink. You see, the eye is composed of 3 cones, and our brain constructs our pictures of colors based on the information that it receives from these cones. Now, you could argue, and convincingly, you could argue that the brain is making a simulation of something that is in fact out there. So that's to say, when you see the color green, yes, your brain is inventing that color, but it reflects something that is actually out there. But in the case of the color pink, this completely breaks down, because there is no electromagnetic radiation which produces in our brain the color pink. The color pink is a color your brain creates when it receives equal signals of red and blue. That's to say, the red cone fires and the blue cone fires. And the brain assumes that between those 2 cones, there must be some other color, right? There must be some amalgamation of red and blue. But in fact, that's not the case. There is no color between red and blue. There is no electromagnetic frequency of photons between red and blue light. What you have is infrared, and then you have X-rays and gamma rays, and everything spreads out in either direction down the spectrum.
This appears blue. This appears yellow, and this appears green. Those of us with normal color vision can probably agree, but that doesn't change the fact that color is an illusion. Color as we know it does not exist in the outside world, beyond us, like gravity or protons do. Instead, color is created inside our heads.
So that really, fundamentally, we can see in the color pink that what we are observing subjectively is really our brain's best guess at what is out there objectively. And in fact, now we know that our brain creates our picture of reality using the information that it receives. In other words, there's even a feedback process. Seth, I believe his name is, a neurologist and a philosopher of mind, is saying that, the brain is sort of projecting its expectations back onto the world, as in the case of this illusion, right? This is something a lot of neurologists and brain scientists, philosophers of mind like to use, because it reveals the fact that you are not seeing what's actually there. You're in fact seeing what you expect to be there. So that your picture of reality is intrinsically illusory. You have never experienced the objective scientific material world directly, because you do not see with the eyes, you do not hear with the ears, and you do not feel with the skin on your hands. All of these things are taking place within the brain. If you snip the neurological cords that tie your eyes to your brain, you'll go blind, and that tells you that seeing is happening in the brain, not in the eyes. The eyes are nothing other than information gathering machines, so that seeing is taking place in the brain. So is hearing, so is feeling, so is tasting, touching, smelling. So you're not actually interacting with the physical world. You're interacting with a simulation of the physical world, which is being constructed by your brain. Now, the implications of this are profound and far-reaching, because what do we traditionally call a simulation created in the brain? We call it a dream.
Does it do the same trick? Does it think, I must be looking at a colour in between red and blue? Well, the colour in between red and blue is green, and you're definitely not looking at something green because your green cone isn't firing. So in that situation, your brain invents a colour. It makes up a colour, and that colour is magenta.
So if there's no such thing as sound and color and light, then what is this thing we're experiencing? Well, it's something comparable to the holodeck. This is, the holodeck on Star Trek, right? But what is producing this holodeck? Well, it appears that the computer responsible is the brain. But that doesn't really solve the fundamental issue of subjectivity, right? What is it that we're seeing? If I'm seeing a dream, if I'm seeing a color, then what is the nature of that substance? What is the nature of the color that I'm perceiving right now? What is it made out of, right? If you take a materialist point of view, the suggestion is that it's nothing, that it in fact does not exist. Or perhaps that these things that we're perceiving are somehow and mysteriously being constructed by some physical thing in the brain. But yet neurology and material science has provided no answer to this. In fact, neurology has come up against an enormous problem in trying to even explain consciousness, let alone the substance of consciousness, let alone the perception of consciousness, right?
Now, I'm a scientific materialist at heart. I want a scientific theory of consciousness that works. And for a long time, I banged my head against the wall, looking for a theory of consciousness in purely physical terms that would work. But I eventually came to the conclusion that that just didn't work for systematic reasons.
So the suggestion seems to be, the more we dissect and break down the brain, the less we see any real translation going on between the information that's there and this subjective experience. We see the information come in, the brain lights up, but where does any of that information go? And how is that information translated into seeing a sunset?
Roger, if I ask the question, what things really exist, to most scientists, they would say, the physical world, that's it. Why'd you ask me such a silly question?
Yes, I suppose they would. Well, I think often people take the view that there is another kind of reality, which is the mental reality. Certainly philosophers might take that view. And I'm sometimes accused of being not just a dualist, but actually a trialist, which is even worse, you see, from some points of view.
Now, this is the assertion of dualists, and the assertion is fundamentally this, that the mind is a reality unto itself, that the mind possesses its own kind of reality, but it is not a gross reality. And this is really, I think, where dreams represent a profound opportunity to investigate, probe, and observe the nature of mind independent of physical reality. Because when you're asleep, you're not looking at the outside world. Your eyes are closed, your whole sensory input system is shut down, and you're observing the nature of subjectivity all on its own. And this really affords us an opportunity to make some observations. What is the nature of dreaming reality? And what's more, it's now scientific fact that you can enter a lucid dream. You can enter a waking condition of dreaming in which you move around a dreamlike reality.
And then there's some superstition called lucid dreaming, where you can actually control the direction of the dream. Well, that superstition last year became science fact. At the Max Planck Institute in Germany, they were able to show once and for all that lucid dreaming is testable, reproducible, it is real.
And it was my ambition to do just that, to enter the condition of lucid dreaming and to make observations within this context. And that's precisely what I did. I achieved the condition of a lucid dream, and I got down on the floor and I looked at the floor and I could see so much detail. And in this case, I was looking at the floor and I was looking at granite tiles, and I could see the individual grains of granite in the tile. And in the dream, I thought to myself, how would I know the difference between waking and dreaming? How would I know whether or not I'm actually awake or asleep?
Have you ever had a dream, Neo, that you were so sure was real? What if you were unable to wake from that dream? How would you know the difference between the dream world and the real world?
But I had inadvertently led myself into a profoundly significant position within Buddhism, and I was a practicing Buddhist at the time.
Main point is here how we can, our real daily life experience combined into the lucid dream. That is the main point.
And this really took me into a case where I was exploring increasing forms of altered states of consciousness, right? I was trying to bend and twist and manipulate my experience of this subjective reality to really test it, to put it to the test, to see, what happens when I bend the brain this much, right? If I put the brain under stress, what am I going to perceive? Well, in Buddhism, there are techniques for doing just that, right? The meditation techniques. And I was performing meditation techniques that probably I shouldn't have been. I was really pushing the envelope. I was going into spaces that perhaps I was not yet ready to be introduced to. And ultimately, I got introduced to the work of Dr. David Lewis Williams. Now, Dr. David Lewis Williams is an anthropologist who has done work with the San Bushmen in the South African Kalahari. And through his research, what he found is that all primitive religions have been employing in one way or another altered states of consciousness for acquiring information of a spiritual variety. In other words, the underpinning quality that you see between all world religions, without exception, is that they all at one time or another, or still continue to do so, look to altered states of consciousness and dreams as meaningful sources of information about reality.
There was indeed something there.
In reading the Blake manuscripts, it became very clear that their religion was built around a notion of traveling to a spirit world.
It seemed the San believed that while you're still alive, your spirit can leave your body and visit the spirit world. It happens when you enter a trance, what's sometimes called an altered state of consciousness. And this San tradition is still practiced today.
So every religion, I mean from the shamans of Africa to the Indians of North America to the Christian mystics of the anchorites to the Sufis of Islam, to the yogis of Hinduism, to the Himalayan meditating monks of Tibetan Buddhism. You find this consistent throughout all religious belief systems, where they are exploring altered states of consciousness in order to gain meaningful information about reality.
Then, in the mind of the spirit of life, a dreaming began.
The dream symbols emerging from the unconscious will be colored not only by the dreamer's unique life experiences, but also their own cultural background. For Native Americans, their sacred traditions and beliefs will be expressed through the images in their dreams.
There is the deep and appealing notion that the universe is but the dream of the God.
All Buddhists believe that the material world is a dreamlike illusion into which they are born and reborn.
How can I increase the likelihood of seeing the Prophet ﷺ in a dream? The first thing to keep in mind is that seeing the Prophet ﷺ in a dream is a blessing to the Ummah because we are...
After a dream in which he met Padre Pio on the road and asked him to save his father, Joe Greco's father suddenly recovered from a dangerous operation.
This is what did it, really. When he saw me, he said, "Well, your father's all right then." Well, it shattered me, really, because I'd never been down in San Giovanni Rotondo before. I'd never been down that part of the world. Neither did I know anyone down there. And yet, I posed in my mind a question to him. I was saying, "Was it you? Was it you?" And he replied, "In the dream. In the dream." Well, I started shaking. I was scared stiff, to tell you the truth. I said, "Yes, Father, in the dream, Father."
I wanted to find out whether Odin was real and who he was, so I decided to call him while out of my body, as ancient texts explain that the place we visit when we dream, often referred to today as the astral plane, is a realm where humans and spiritual beings, often called gods, cross over and can meet.
It's hard to argue against the possibility that all of us are not just the creation of some kid in a parent's basement programming up a world for their own entertainment.
Now, from this perspective, all of a sudden, religion starts to make an enormous amount of sense, because you start looking at things like, for instance, the creation story of Genesis. Well, everyone laughs, right? And naturally, I mean, talking snakes, right? In a garden, come on. It sounds like a fairy tale. It sounds like a dream, right? So, is, the Bible talking about literal historical realities? Or is it talking about an instance in which the dreaming world and the waking world have come into some kind of an ambiguity? And this, I think, is without question precisely what we're seeing in the Bible, because we have it attested in the text itself. We have St. Peter in the Acts of the Apostles saying, "I wasn't sure if I was awake or if I was asleep." And St. Paul tells us, "I was not sure if I was in the body or out of the body." So the defining quality of biblical mystics is that they come into an altered state of consciousness, but they then begin to experience a vision, an experience of the spirit world, which is so vivid, so real, that they cannot tell the difference between being awake and being asleep. So when you read about the apocalypse, is the apocalypse some historical reality that's likely to take place in the future, or is this something more appropriate to the psyche? Let me tell you something. When you read the Tibetan Book of the Dead, it sounds a whole lot like the biblical apocalypse, right? The dream of your life is essentially dismantled. And the Tibetan Book of the Dead always reassures its reader by saying, "Do not be terrified. Do not be frightened. It is nothing other than a projection of your own mind." Now, with all of this in mind, I was again pushing further and further through altered states, and I came across the work of the Mandukya Upanishad, which had a profound implication in my understanding of these things, wherein which the Mandukya Upanishad describes 4 distinct levels of this inner psychic reality. You see, in Hinduism, they don't speak of the gods as being men who live on the clouds. If they do, they mean that only in the way of a metaphor, Rather, the gods are manifestations of inner psychological realities that are appropriate to an inner cosmos. And what's more is that the Mandukya Upanishad lays this out for us in a neat and concise and tidy way. It says that on the top level you have waking awareness, below that you have dreaming awareness, and below that you have the void of dreamless sleep that one can enter in a conscious and waking state. You can actually come into this vast open emptiness that is in fact the area within the psyche in which the mind, the conscious mind, resides during what we traditionally think of dreaming or sleeping without dreams. Now what's fascinating about that, and this is something that I've really gleaned from observing my mind during meditations and in different contexts, it seems to me that consciousness is never something that ever stops. Consciousness never ceases. What really ceases is our ability to form memories. That to me, I remember I was sitting in meditation posture one night, and I was really going deeper and deeper and deeper into myself until eventually I came into this position in which no new thoughts were arising. There were no new thoughts being created and no new thoughts or old thoughts being recalled. I was not recollecting and I was not thinking about the future. I was completely in the moment, and I lost the perception of time. I remember I came out of the meditation and I looked at my girlfriend at the time and I said, "How long have I been sitting here?" It felt as if I had slept into a condition of sleeping without ever actually falling asleep. It was not like I went into a condition of sleeping and then woke up. It was more like awake, asleep, awake. There was no tapering of drowsiness or falling into, or images coming up, dreamlike images, none of that. It was a straight, and I recognized that the distinction in my stream of consciousness was one predicated simply on the recollection or the premonition of thoughts and ideas. There was no thinking and there was no recalling. In fact, I went in for a medical procedure recently, and I had this kind of reaffirmed when the anesthesiologist used some fentanyl. If you give somebody a high enough dose of fentanyl, they just basically lose consciousness. And it was profound because when I was coming out of the anesthesia, I looked around and I went, "Oh yeah, I'm in a hospital." You see, there was a conscious recollection. Consciousness was not what arose when I began perceiving. Consciousness was what arose when I recalled what it was that I was perceiving. Now that's a subtle distinction, but it's a very important distinction. And the Hindus tell us that the nature of consciousness is eternal, that consciousness cannot be created, it cannot be destroyed, it cannot die, that consciousness persists. What dies, what falls away, is merely the substance to which consciousness has become attached.
With each other is known as the mind-body problem. This is the problem that makes us wonder, how can my body have a separate entity called a mind lurking inside of it, controlling it and being controlled by it? What would tether my mind to this body in particular? Why couldn't my mind just go running off on its own or take a dip into other bodies to see what it's like in there?
Now this is something that has profound implications for the philosophy of mind. Philosophers have asked the question, what is responsible for the mind not just leaving the body, right? What's responsible for the mind attaching itself to a particular physical body and not leaving and inhabiting some other body? If the mind is independent of the body, why doesn't our mind just routinely jump off? Well, what appears to be the case is that the mind, consciousness, becomes fixed on a body on the basis of emotional attachment. This is why shamans who are entering altered states of consciousness say that they are dying.
He did indeed seem to be going into some kind of trance. Then he fell to the ground, unconscious. I'd been told that when the shamans enter a trance, they sometimes lose consciousness, and while in this state, they say, they die and they visit the spirit world.
They're not dying in the sense of, oh, my heart is stopping, right? That's not what they're talking about. What they're talking about is this feeling, this horrible feeling, and I know the feeling because I felt it, where you feel your attachments to life being pulled out, like cords being pulled out of a like an old phone or an old phone booth. They used to plug the wires in, right? Well, imagine each wire is one of your attachments, so you say, well, that's my love for my mother, and that's my love for my sister, and that's my love for my car, and that's my love for my house and my wife and my kids and my body, and all of these things, all of my accomplishments and memories, right? Well, just imagine how it would feel to sit there as all of these are just being unplugged, right? You're sitting there and you're going, my God, I'm dying. I'm losing everything. It feels so fucking bad, right? Pardon my language, but it is a horrible experience. But that is precisely what is happening when a mystic enters an altered state of consciousness. They are entering into a condition wherein which all of their attachments are being undermined. And keep in mind, this is also a universal constituent that we see throughout all forms of religious faith. That all religions attest to the fact that there is this organizing nucleus within the center of the psyche. We see this in the native Indians with Mistapeo, within Christianity as Christ, the indweller of the heart. We see it in Hinduism as the Atman, Buddhism as the Buddha nature that's within everyone. So they all agree that there is this organizing nucleus, and they also agree that the process of letting go of our attachments, as Christ says, if you love your life, you will lose it, but if you give up your life, you will keep it, right? There's this accent on abandoning affections for the world. John goes as far as to say those who love the world have no love of the Father in them, right? So in order to come into these altered conditions, into these experiences of the spirit world, these waking experiences of stepping beyond the threshold of this brain-constructed material reality, we must endure the disillusionment of all of our attachments. And that enables us to step through into the spiritual dimension of reality. And that's precisely what I did. I put these things to the test. I went ahead and I used LSD to put myself into an altered state of consciousness, and then as a consequence I began to perceive the apocalypse. I thought that the world was ending. I began to treat that hallucination as though it were a chapter from the Tibetan Book of the Dead. I used the 16th Karma meditation, and I was then able consequently to lift up out of my body and to enter the void of dreamless sleep. And it was there that I spoke to a red being of light. Amitabha Buddha is who I think it was now. But in the end, what I encountered was a white light. And when I encountered the white light, which in Buddhism is called the Dharmakaya, I said to myself, Jesus, what are you doing here? Because I recognized the presence of that light. It was the presence of the Holy Spirit that I had first been introduced to as a Christian. And in the end, that was ultimately what led me back to Catholic Christianity. And it's for that reason that I am not an atheist, and I will never be an atheist again. And, this is not something that is mere conjecture for me anymore, because I've observed it. I've put it to the test. And in this video, I've laid out for you a roadmap. I mean, you can put these things to the test. You can observe these things for yourself. But ultimately, no one, and let me repeat this, no one can force you to observe the substance of your own mind. If you're unwilling to explore your own dreams, if you're unwilling to entertain religious methods, if you're unwilling to even entertain these possibilities as ideas that could in fact be out there, no one is going to be able to force your hand into observing the substance of your own mind. Really, religious observations are accomplished. They're achieved through striving. And therefore, when atheists say, well, present us proof of God's existence, it's a ridiculous request. Because ultimately, God is not an object to be possessed. God is not something you buy on a store shelf and put under a microscope. God is not something that you can look at through a telescope out in space. God is an experience that is had within the psyche. But what's more is that you don't even necessarily have to call it God. This is the tremendous irony that you realize when you go through these things, that God is really merely a human concept that we use to describe this transcendental mystery. And the Buddhists, for instance, choose to avoid using that metaphor. So if you, as an atheist, say, well, I really just can't accept this notion of a God, it seems too ridiculous to me, well, then by all means, you don't really need to, right? Buddhism and many branches of Hinduism allow you to retain atheistic beliefs while still probing these spiritual realities. And that really, to me, is the crux of what has to happen in Western society. Because we have this ridiculous, this absurd dialogue going on between fundamentalist Christians who are trying to argue about, you know, talking snakes and snakes with 4 legs and flipping fire-breathing dragons. And then on the other hand, you have atheists who are just as much fixed in this ideological reality of materialism, and neither one of them is stepping outside of that paradigm to really question the subjective experience of reality. And what's more is that this explanation, the explanation of dreams, is something that we see throughout all world religions. It's a universal truth. It's not something that's isolated to one little community. It's observable, it's testable, it's falsifiable, and it's the truth. And I can attest to that because I've seen it, and I can encourage you, I would challenge you to go and look at it for yourself. One of my viewers, Jared, you know, he's been a viewer of the channel now for some time, and he recently messaged me, and he said, this was back in November, you know, and he says, dude, I had a precognitive dream. You know, he says he had a dream in which he found himself driving in a car, and then he had a car accident, and he was sitting at a light, and he was about to pull through, and he remembered the dream and stopped the car. And as a consequence, he was saved from a car accident. And I'll show you guys here the conversation that was had, right? So for me, this is not something that's really up for debate anymore. This is, you know, Carl Gustav Jung was absolutely justified in saying only ignorance deny these facts. I mean, if you don't believe me, have a look on, you know, some of these videos about precognitive dreams and have a look through the comments. You will find dozens and dozens and dozens of people who have attested to having this experience of reality. And we're going to see an increasing number of people who are exploring altered states of consciousness and coming to convictions about religion for themselves. They're making observations, they're achieving private revelations, and they're coming to these convictions on their own. And what is dying in religion is not religion itself, but fundamentalism and literalism, this ridiculous idea that one religion is right and all the others are tricked by the devil. That's going away. What's also going away is stupid things like thinking God is a literal man who lives in the sky. You know, that kind of nonsense is dying. This is what in traditional religions is referred to as idolatry, treating the metaphors as if they're reality. I mean, these literalists and fundamentalists, you know, that think, you know, the Garden of Eden story took place in history. I wonder why they haven't cut off their hands and plucked out their eyes. I mean, that's what Jesus tells us to do. Literally, he says in the text, if you sin, pluck out your eyes. Well, why do you still have 2 eyes? You know, Ken Ham, why haven't you plucked out your eyes yet, right? This is this ridiculous absurdity that we see within Western religion, and atheism really is the remedy to this insanity. And so for that reason, I don't really see atheism as the enemy of religion. In fact, whether the atheists know it or not, they are really helping religion by extracting this cancer that has managed to take root in religious and spiritual thinking.
To be or not to be? That is the question. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles, and by opposing end them, to die, to sleep, no more, and by a sleep to say we end the heartache and the 1,000 natural shocks that flesh is heir to. 'Tis a consummation devoutly to be wished. To die, to sleep, perchance to dream. Aye, there's the rub. For in that sleep of death, what dreams may come.
Joe.